Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Next is Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. Mr. Zuckerberg, I want to begin by just asking a simple question, which is, do you want kids to use your platform more or less?
Well, we don't want people under the age of 13 using.
Do you want teenagers 13 and up to use your platform more or less?
Well, we would like to build a product that is useful and that people want to use more.
My time is going to be limited, so it's just, do you want them to use it more or less? Teenagers 13 to 17 years old, do you want them using Meta products more or less?
I'd like them to be useful enough that they want to use them more.
You want them to use it more. I think herein we have one of the fundamental challenges. In fact, you have a fiduciary obligation, do you not, to try to get kids to use your platform more?
It depends on how you define that. We obviously are a business.
I'm sorry, Mr. Zuckerberg, just our time is, it's self-evident that you have a fiduciary obligation to get your users, including users under 18, to use and engage with your platform more rather than less, correct?
Over the long term, but in the near term, we often take a lot of steps, including we made a change to show less videos that on the platform that reduced amount of time by more than 50 million hours.
Okay, but if your shareholders ask you, Mark, I wouldn't, Mr. Zuckerberg here, but your shareholders might be on a first-name basis with you. Mark, are you trying to get kids to use Meta products more or less? You'd say more, right?
Well, I would say that over the long term, we're trying to create the most
I mean,
value
let's look. So the 10K you file with the SEC, a few things I want to note. Here are some quotes, and this is a filing that you signed, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Our financial performance has been and will continue to be significantly determined by our success in adding, retaining, and engaging active users. Here's another quote. If our users decrease their level of engagement with our products, our revenue, financial results, and business may be significantly harmed. Here's another quote. We believe that some users, particularly younger users, are aware of and actively engaging with other products and services similar to or as a substitute for ours. It continues, in the event that users increasingly engage with other products and services, we may experience a decline in use and engagement in key demographics or more broadly, in which case our business would likely be harmed. You have an obligation as the chief executive to encourage your team to get kids to use your platform more.
Senator,
Fundamental,
I think this is...
is that not self-evident? You have a fiduciary
Senator,
obligation to your shareholders to get kids to use your platform more.
I think that the thing that's not intuitive is the direction is to make the products more useful, so that way people want to use them more. We don't give the teams running the Instagram feed or the Facebook feed a goal to increase the amount of time that people spend.
Yeah, but you don't dispute, and your 10K makes clear you want your users engaging more and using more the platform. And I think this gets to the root of the challenge because it's the overwhelming view of the public, certainly in my home state of Georgia, and we've had some discussions about the underlying science, that this platform is harmful for children. I mean, you are familiar with, and not just your platform, by the way, social media in general. 2023 report from the Surgeon General about the impact of social media on kids' mental health, which cited evidence that kids who spend more than 3 hours a day on social media have double the risk of poor mental health outcomes, including depression and anxiety. Are you familiar with that Surgeon General report and the underlying study?
I read the report, yes.
Do you dispute it?
No, but I think it's important to characterize it correctly. I think what he was flagging in the report is that there seems to be a correlation, and obviously the mental health issue is very important, so it's something that needs to be studied further.
Yeah, we know. The thing is, that's everyone knows there's a correlation. Everyone knows that kids who spend a lot of time, too much time on your platforms are at risk. And it's not just the mental health issues. I mean, let me ask you another question. Is your platform safe for kids?
I believe it is, but there's an important difference between correlation and causation.
Because we're not going to be able to get anywhere. We want to work in a productive, open, honest, and collaborative way with the private sector to pass legislation that will protect Americans, that will protect American children above all, and that will allow businesses to thrive in this country. If we don't start with an open, honest, candid, realistic assessment of the issues, we can't do that. The first point is you want kids to use the platform more. In fact, you have an obligation to. But if you're not willing to acknowledge that it's a dangerous place for children, the internet is a dangerous place for children, not just your platform, isn't it? Isn't the internet a dangerous place for children?
I think it can be. Yeah, there's both great things that people can do, and there are harms that we need to work to
Yeah,
mitigate.
it's a dangerous place for children. There are families here who have lost their children. There are families across the country whose children have engaged in self-harm, who have experienced low self-esteem, who have been sold deadly pills on the internet. The internet's a dangerous place for children, and your platforms are dangerous places for children. Do you agree?
I think that there are harms that we need to work to mitigate.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not going to, I think overall
Why not?
there...
Why not? Why not just acknowledge it? Why do we have to do the very
Well,
careful code?
I disagree with the characterization
Which character,
that you have.
that the internet's a dangerous place for children?
I think you're trying to characterize our products as inherently dangerous, and I think that...
Inherent
First-
or not, your products are places where children can experience harm. They can experience harm to their mental health. They can be sold drugs. They can be preyed upon by predators. They're dangerous places. And yet, you have an obligation to promote the use of these platforms by children. And look, all I'm trying to suggest to you, Mr. Zuckerberg, and my time is running short, is that in order for you to succeed, you and your colleagues here, we have to acknowledge these basic truths. We have to be able to come before the American people, the American public, the people in my state of Georgia, and acknowledge the internet is dangerous, including your platforms. There are predators lurking. There are drugs being sold. There are harms to mental health that are taking a huge toll on kids' quality of life. And yet, you have this incentive, not just you, Mr. Zuckerberg, all of you have an incentive to boost, maximize use, utilization, and engagement, and that is where public policy has to step in to make sure that these platforms are safe for kids, so kids are not dying, so kids are not overdosing, so kids are not cutting themselves or killing themselves because they're spending all day scrolling instead of playing outside. And I appreciate all of you for your testimony. We will continue to engage as we develop this legislation. Thank you.
Senator from Tennessee.
Okay. Well, my time's up, Chairman. Thank you for the hearing. Thank you to this distinguished panel. And Mr. Wetzel, thank you for your service.
Senator Whitehouse, I'm grateful. I'm told by my staff the order of appearance, and this order will go into Senator Ossoff, Senator Padilla, and no disrespect to the two aforementioned gentlemen, the best for last, Senator Welsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing us together. Grateful also to Senator Cotton for supporting this hearing, and thank you to our panelists for your expertise and experience. Mrs. White, as you know, Senator Braun, Chair Durbin, and I have introduced bipartisan legislation to overhaul federal prison oversight and strengthen security at federal prisons. And the purpose of this bill is to help identify and address threats to the safety and welfare of both incarcerated people and the thousands of correctional officers and others who work in our federal prisons every day, and that's the Federal Prison Oversight Act. Mrs. White, the Council of Prison Locals, which represents more than 30,000 correctional officers, worked with us to develop this legislation and has endorsed the legislation. Can you speak to the committee about why correctional officers support our bill and what it would mean for your members who are working in federal prisons every day?
Sure. So as you said, we have been in support and we have worked really hard to help get this. We have, for years, the Council of Prison Locals, the union, has gone to bat and asked for additional funding. For years, we thought funding was our only issue. If we could get more money, we could fix the problems. And the union was very successful in doing so, but over the years, we have come to know that funding is not the issue. Sometimes it might be an oversight issue of where the funding is going. So we have been strategic in where we asked for funding the last couple of years. This year, we probably will be a little even more strategic, but as I said in my opening and in the written statement, we welcome any oversight. We need accountability. We need help. The Bureau, I think, is the second largest in DOJ budget, and we're not sure where all of that money is going. And so any oversight from anyone, I think, would be super helpful.
Well, I'm grateful to you and your organization for helping us to develop this legislation and for the advocacy of the correctional officers across the country who are urging Congress to pass it. It's a bipartisan bill aimed at improving oversight within BOP, strengthening the security of federal prisons. It's got strong support from the Council of Prison Locals, strong support from reform advocates, and look forward to working with you to continue to urge it across the finish line here in the Senate and in the House. Mr. Wetzel, you, I believe, are also familiar with the legislation. And based upon your extensive experience working in corrections, what impact do you believe it would have on conditions and safety in federal prisons, both for incarcerated people and staff?
It's essential. I don't see how you make progress in the federal system without knowing. You can't even lay out a data-driven or problem statement because you don't have enough information. The very essence of fixing a problem is being able to define it and come up with a problem statement. Independent oversight and that kind of forced transparency, real time on a regular basis is essential to moving the Bureau of Prisons forward and any agency forward.
Well, I appreciate your input and your support for the legislation as well. And I want to talk a little bit about the impact of understaffing on some of these specific safety issues. I led a PSI investigation a couple years ago, found that female inmates in more than 2/3 of federal prisons that housed female inmates had faced sexual abuse from BOP employees. How do chronic understaffing issues lead to a higher incidence of abuse? And again, just to clarify, make sure I presented the statistic correctly, in 2/3 of federal prisons that housed female inmates faced sexual abuse from BOP employees. How is this linked to understaffing?
Yeah, I think assault by a staff member, assault by another incarcerated person, name any bad event, and the very essence of stopping bad events is supervision. And you design facilities and you design them with a staffing plan. And so when you have half the people to do that staffing plan, and you have let's say you have 100 housing units and you have 50 people to cover them, there's no one on those housing units. And at some point, the human beings on those housing units who are locked in cells have to come out of those cells. They have to be fed. They have to get medication. There's a series of things that happen. Without people, it doesn't happen. And so when you get people out and there's nobody there, there may be some folks who are among them who want to do harm to them. So it undermines supervision, and these staffing shortages filter the whole way up. One of the things that I think is a really good illustration for you of how staffing impacts other things is we heard about BOP issuing a memo about something. I forget what it was, but the memo was issued from the director, and this is pre-Collette, and you observed at the IG observed at several prisons that it wasn't happening, right? That communication has to happen through people. You're talking about a 40% vacancy rate. These guys need roller skates. I mean, if you've done just a round in a federal prison, right? You think you can just walk through and not get stopped by someone, or if something's going on? It's wide open for what can happen when you have half the people you need. There's no kiosks in corrections. It doesn't work like that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wetzel, and thank you. And one thing that's become very clear to me through the oversight that I've worked on these issues is a shocking statistic like that. It's not an indictment of the overall BOP workforce. The overwhelming majority of correctional officers are hardworking public servants who try to do the right thing every day. Failures by management, failures at headquarters, failures at high levels of the federal government have put these teams in impossible circumstances. And the Federal Prison Oversight Act, a bipartisan bill with strong support across the board, is vital to addressing these issues. Thank you all for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff, for your, not just questions in this hearing, but for your work.
Senator Cotton, you would be next, but if you'd like a minute, Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Cotton. And thank you both for being here. It's a pleasure to see you both again. Director Peters, following up on Senator Booker's question about retention incentives, at USP Atlanta, as at so many facilities, there are severe staffing issues, a real difficulty recruiting and retaining staff. I had sent you a letter asking that BOP undertake what efforts it could to add retention incentives, take steps to ensure that those correctional officers are well paid and can be retained. And you've replied, which I appreciate, just like your commitment to continue working with my office to make sure that we are treating those correctional officers well, paying them properly, and retaining their services.
Thank you, Senator. I'm certainly committed to that. We have thrown every incentive that we can that's in our authority, recruitment incentives, retention incentives, and at the core of many of the issues that the Inspector General reveals is a lack of staffing. And so this is incredibly important to us. As I said in my opening comments, while the incentives have proven a Band-Aid effect, we need to increase the base salary for these correctional officers so we can hire the best and the brightest and then keep them.
Okay, well, I'm hoping we can work together to identify some additional tools that may be available for the team at USP Atlanta. Let's remain on the subject of staffing. In 2021, BOP hired a contractor to develop a tool that was intended to help the Bureau determine necessary staffing levels for safety at BOP facilities, correct?
That's correct.
And in March 2023, so a year ago approximately, BOP reported that the tool was still being tested in 3 of BOP's 6 regions and said it would be rolled out to all 6 BOP regions by June of 2023. Did that happen?
Senator, I'm not sure exactly when it was rolled out, but we have completed the initial data analysis as it relates to those employees who are in the Correctional Services Program Division, and they are recommending an additional 3,500 positions in that category going forward.
In how many regions is that tool currently being used, and is it being used for USP Atlanta, for example?
So I think it's important to understand that that tool is to help us plan for future budget planning and requests. That tool won't help me with the crisis today because I already cannot fill the positions that you've paid for today.
But in how many regions is that tool currently being used?
That 3,500 is all 6. And then, Senator, the next category that they're working on right now is health services, which we have difficulty maintaining and recruiting staff in that category as well.
My office, several offices on this committee have asked for a demonstration of this tool and been told that BOP won't provide it because the tool is still being refined. Can you make sure that we are able to view and observe and participate in a demonstration of that tool within the next several weeks?
Senator, I will work with my team and see the availability and where we're at with the tool and our ability to share it with you.
We can't understand why we can't see it. Doesn't make any sense. We should be able to come and see the tool.
Thank you, Senator. I'll work with my team and see what we can do.
Well, I hope that we can come and see it in short order. Now, I understand BOP conducted an inspection of FPC Alderson earlier this year. My team has requested a copy of that inspection report. Sounds like BOP is working on it. Do I have your commitment to get that to us promptly?
Thank you, Senator. You have my commitment to work with your team to get it to you as quickly as we can.
Thank you very much. Inspector General, your report has detailed how BOP staff were in some cases not carrying out key duties, including required inmate mental health assessments, counts and rounds and trainings, among others. It found that these operational failures contributed to deaths in custody. How significant a role did understaffing play in those failures?
I think it's a very significant problem here. It's been a challenge that we've seen not only in deaths, but as we've gone to prisons to inspect them, and the problems that go both for correctional officers who are substantially understaffed, ultimately being asked to work sometimes voluntarily, sometimes mandatory overtime. Then we have augmentation, which is pulling healthcare potentially, educational staff potentially, facility staff potentially to cover the duties of the correctional officers, which has a cascading effect, meaning there are long waits for First Step Act training. Healthcare staffing can be, shortages are exacerbated and things like that. So it's a big challenge.
Thank you, Inspector General. With my remaining time, Director Peters, I want to follow up on an issue at USP Atlanta. As you know, a PSI investigation that I led several years ago found very substantial flow of contraband into the facility, including weapons and narcotics. IG's recent report found that contraband drugs or weapons contributed to nearly 1/3 of deaths in custody at BOP. What steps, Director, have you taken to address the flow of contraband and the threat that poses to public safety at BOP facilities, and in particular at USP Atlanta, please?
At USP Atlanta, the issues that were uncovered still fall into these two categories: lack of staffing and our maintenance and repair backlog. As we were able to show you during your visit at USP Atlanta, that facility structure was crumbling, and it allowed for hiding contraband inside our institution. So we're working to maintain our facilities in a way where they are safe and secure, but we're also working every day to interdict contraband in our institutions through the use of detecting and stopping drone activity, looking at the mail and looking at ways to stop drugs from coming in via the mail. We work diligently to ensure that anyone entering our institution has a background check and is physically screened before they come inside. So this is something that is absolutely top of mind. As you well know and pointed out, contraband is a significant issue and can lead to lost lives or even impact the safety and security of our employees.
Can I just speak to the contraband issue, because it's such a significant issue? It's connected to, we found 1/3 of the deaths in our review and in the report. We've been on inspections, and we were at FCI Tallahassee, for example, at an inspection, and our team went, and what you saw there in terms of challenges on contraband with inmate potentially smuggling contraband. Inmates who were working near the fence lines could easily have something thrown over a fence to them. Inmates who went out to collect garbage were not being checked as they brought bags back into the facility. Some basic stuff that you would think, it's not sophisticated to figure out how to try and interdict that kind of contraband. And not surprisingly, by the way, the prison with the highest number of deaths in our report was USP Atlanta, which had been closed in 2021 precisely because of the hundreds of, the dozens of cell phones and drugs found in the prison. And so this is a major problem. We've had a staff search policy recommendation open for years that has not been implemented, a basic search policy for staff coming in to the facility that hasn't happened either. So there are a lot of challenges on the contraband issue that are very significant, that we're concerned is contributing to inmate deaths, both from homemade weapons and from drugs being brought into the facility.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Senator Cotton?
Director Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank Senator Cornyn for raising the urgent concern associated with the counterterrorism threat and unlawful entry at the southern border. We should be losing sleep over it. But, Mr. Chairman, that's why it's inexcusable that we were blocked even from debating and amending Senator Lankford's bipartisan proposal. Senator Lee made reference to what a normal legislative body would do under these circumstances. Well, a normal legislative body would proceed to debate of the bill, consider amendments, and then members would have the opportunity to block cloture on passage if the amendments were deemed insufficient. There was an opportunity to offer amendments related to parole. I'd be willing to work with you on them. There was an opportunity to offer amendments to improve the bill, to plug what's been described as loopholes. And if those amendments were insufficient, there was another vote that would have had a 60-vote threshold at which senators could have prevented progress on the bill. Instead, the Senate was not even allowed to get on the bill and debate it and consider amendments. I don't think that anyone in this body is interested right now in lectures on border security from Senate Republicans after we were prevented even from debating the legislation and considering amendments, given the urgency of the national security concerns that Senator Cornyn rightly raised today. I am one of those Democrats that for the last several years has in public criticized members of my own party for dismissing national security concerns associated with the chaos at the southern border. But the parade of excuses that we've heard this morning, trying to rationalize the blocking of even an opportunity to debate and amend legislation drafted by Senator Langford, Republican of Oklahoma, sterling national security and border security credentials, is completely unpersuasive. Everyone knows why we were blocked from debating and amending that bill. Presidential year politics. Everyone knows it. And I wish I respect the confidentiality of my conversations with my colleagues, so I won't make them public. But I do wish that the American public could hear some of the private conversations I had with my Republican friends in the hours before that legislation was stopped in its tracks. In the hours before the most significant prospect for the Senate acting on border security in over a decade was stopped in its tracks. Because in private, many of my colleagues openly acknowledged that it was the former president coming out against this legislation. Fear of primary challenges that motivated their vote. It had nothing to do with the substance of the underlying bill, which, again, members would have had the opportunity to amend had the debate itself not be filibustered. So let's dispense with this whole charade that the issue was substantive. If the issue were substantive, we should have gotten on the bill and considered amendments. And it could have been stopped later in the process if those amendments were deemed insufficient. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Lee?
I'd like a chance to respond. Thank you. Okay. Let's go back to the last time we undertook a major effort to reform our immigration laws. Remember that? It's known as the Gang of Eight moment. In the Judiciary Committee, we spent weeks, literally weeks, I think it was about a month, just in a markup on that bill. Well, not hearings, just in the markup itself. Immigration law is fairly complex, and you tweak one provision, it can have 12 spillover ramifications. So we wanted to be careful about how to do it. We entertained amendments. We voted on dozens and dozens of amendments. It finally passed out of committee. It ultimately got to the Senate floor, and it ended up passing. I didn't vote for that one. I had some deep concerns with it, but it had a process. Now, to be short, the proposal negotiated by three of our colleagues, two Democrats and one Republican, wasn't as big as that one. I don't think it would have needed an entire month of markup. It's something that probably could have been marked up much faster than that, but it certainly, on no planet could you describe it as being so simple that it didn't need a markup at all. And not only did it not need a markup, it didn't even need a hearing before the Committee of Jurisdiction, which is this committee. It never came before this committee at all. Instead, it was airdropped onto the senators Sunday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, just between 24 and 48 hours before we're expected to vote on it. So, look, where there is some bipartisan consensus, this is a great way to incubate those. This is the way to incubate those. Take this to the committee where some of these ideas can be vetted and ferreted out. I think some of the problems with that bill could have and would have naturally been clarified, repaired by the time they got to the floor had we done that here.
Thank you, Senator Lee.
Well, hang on. I will finish. Just give me a couple more minutes. I'm almost finished. As to your point, Senator Ossoff, about cloture, I understand the point. I do. But been around this place long enough to know that that's kind of it's like a teaser rate. That's a tricky moment. The minute you support cloture on the motion to proceed to a measure, you sort of flip the script. Now, I often vote for cloture on the motion to proceed to a bill that I don't think it's perfect and that I couldn't vote for ultimately at that moment. But sometimes I'll vote for it anyway on cloture on the motion to proceed if I think it's sufficiently close to where it reasonably could be amended to the point I could support it. This one didn't match that. And so if you vote on cloture on the motion to proceed at that point, you're not necessarily saying kill this forever, but you're saying it's not quite ready for that. But once you do it, you're onto the bill, it has more momentum. And then it's the job of those with concerns with the measure, it's their job to then win amendment votes to remove the objectionable language. There was so much objectionable language in this. Knowing as we are that Republicans are in the minority, it would have been exceedingly difficult to win those votes. So that was our shot. And that's why it's entirely reasonable to oppose cloture on the motion to proceed to that bill and still have a desire to amend the underlying bill, the supplemental, to insert U.S. border security language into it. That's what we were trying to do. That was not unreasonable. And you may have heard from people about President Trump. Look, nobody's been in more conversations of Republican senators, all of them and every subset imaginable of them. I can tell you, if there are people for whom President Trump and presidential politics was the deciding issue, I don't know who those are. I know many, many multiples of anyone you could identify in this who had made up their minds even before he weighed in, at least based on what little they knew, and who would have made up their minds once we ultimately got the measure, again, just 48 hours before we were to vote on it. Thank you.
4 words. Former President Trump said 4 words. Blame it on me. I saw it on television. I think it's true. I don't think it was a product of AI. Blame it on me. I just have to back up with Senator Ossoff.
Holding the hearing.
Thanks, Senator Whitehouse and Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. You know, Mr. Hewitt, it is extraordinary the lengths to which Republican state legislators in Georgia have gone to try to make it harder for some folks to vote. They passed legislation that makes it harder to request an absentee ballot, that shrinks the period of runoff elections to drive up lines at polling places during early voting in runoff elections, that allows anybody to file limitless, frivolous challenges to the eligibility to vote of their own neighbors. So I was 6 activists on the basis of this in 2022 challenged the registrations of 89,000 Georgia voters. All of this intended to make it harder for some folks to vote and therefore to gain an edge in elections. It's about partisan political power. I am introducing today legislation called the Right to Vote Act. And this bill would empower voters to challenge in court any action taken by a state or local government that makes it harder to vote, and force that state or that locality to demonstrate that the restrictions serve some governmental purpose and are the least restrictive means of doing so. Mr. Hewitt, why is it essential that voters be able to challenge voter suppression policies in court?
It's essential because otherwise they have rights with no remedy. And that's exactly what some people are after. You know, we had to fight tooth and nail, Senator Ossoff, just to get a preliminary injunction on a couple of those provisions that you mentioned, on the line warming provision outside of 150 feet of a polling place, and also the provision that trick voters where you have to have your date of birth on an absentee ballot, and many people just write the date that they're submitting the ballot by instinct. And so it was viewed as immaterial by the court. But there's so many other provisions that have not been addressed. But your legislation is so critical, we believe, we're glad to see you introduce it, because the notion of a positive affirmative right is what we should have in this country. We have the constitutional provision that prohibits discrimination in voting, and statutory provisions which we seek to strengthen, but a positive affirmative right is what this country should be all about. And so we applaud your introduction and look forward to supporting your legislation.
Well, thank you for supporting the bill. And the basic idea is that if states or local governments are going to make it harder for eligible voters to vote, then they should have to be able to prove in court why it's necessary and that it's the least restrictive means of achieving whatever their objective is. And I just want to reflect in closing here on the context for what's happened in Georgia.
Well,
Let me just say, Mr. because we had just concluded a presidential election and two of the most consequential Senate runoffs in U.S. history. Democrats had prevailed in those races. The former president, as you'll recall, had put immense pressure on the governor of Georgia, the Secretary of State of Georgia, to commit what may have been felony election crimes and overturn the results. You'll recall the former president saying, just find me 12 or 13,000 votes to try to overturn the outcome of the election. No evidence whatsoever supporting the former president's conspiracy theory has been presented. There was just a lengthy piece written in the AJC by a gentleman named Ken Block, who was hired by the Trump campaign to try to find this alleged fraud. He found none. Nevertheless, the state legislature advanced this legislation, passed a law to drive up the time it takes to wait in line to vote during runoffs, make it so no one can bring you so much as a drink of water while you're standing in line, allow these unlimited challenges. I mean, the fact that people are spending their time filing frivolous challenges to their fellow Americans' eligibility to vote should outrage us. And we need to establish, as a matter of federal law, that voters have a say in court where their rights are infringed without some specific reason for the restriction and a demonstration that it's the least restrictive means of doing so. I thank you all for your testimony, your expertise, and your advocacy.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. There's
Dr. Denard, thank you for joining us and sharing your story with us. I want to talk about the availability of OB care, particularly in parts of the country with extraordinarily high rates of maternal mortality and shortages of qualified obstetric clinicians. In the state of Georgia, just for context, half of our counties have no OBGYN at all. We have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country. And I hear consistently in rural communities, and in fact, just a few days ago on a defense installation in Georgia, speaking with service members and military spouses, just how dire this lack of access to obstetric care is. And of course, it's not just OBGYNs, it's obstetric nurses, it's midwives, with sometimes deadly consequences for women who are unable to access health care, perinatal health care. Georgia has passed one of the most extreme abortion bans in the country at 6 weeks before many women even know they're pregnant. One of the things that I'm hearing is that the fear of criminal prosecution of doctors deters OBGYN residents from pursuing training in states with those kinds of extreme abortion bans. And I think as the clinicians here probably know from their experience, my understanding is that doctors are much more likely to stay in practice where they've trained. The question for you is, based upon your experience as a doctor, what's the impact on local communities when there are no OBGYNs or the nearest qualified provider is 90-minute drive away?
Thank you for highlighting this really important issue. Personally, I practice in a large metropolitan area in Texas, but what I can say is that many medical journals will show it's no surprise that when there's lack of access to care, there are very poor outcomes. And patients have to travel. They have to travel now to get the care that they need, and that distance is becoming further and further for them. So what happens is the areas that have lack of access to care, patients travel and overwhelm other areas where there is more access to care, and there are bad outcomes. So it's quite devastating to the women in our country, and it's negatively affecting my specialty significantly.
Thank you, Dr. Denard. Ms. Hurd, I've heard, my office has heard in the last few weeks from a huge number of Georgians who are scared that the direction my state is on, the direction the country is on, could deny Georgia families access to IVF. We saw what happened in Alabama. We see more and more extreme policies. A 6-week ban, for example, far out of the mainstream, opposed by most Georgians, deterring OBGYNs from practicing in the state. We see more and more of this being pushed across the country since the Dobbs decision. And so families are afraid that they may not have access to IVF. They may not, therefore, have the opportunity to achieve the blessing and responsibilities of parenthood. What is your message for families in Georgia and across the country who feel fear right now that their path to conception and parenthood may be closed to them by political extremists?
Thank you, Senator, for asking that question. I think I mentioned in my testimony that I've never advocated for anything before. Me being here today is completely new territory for me. But when everything kind of took place in Alabama, I felt attacked. I felt like my family was being attacked, my future family was being attacked. And I know so many other women personally that are going through the process that, unfortunately haven't had success as of yet. But I knew that I needed to step up and let my voice be heard, not just for me and my experience, but also for all those others that don't have the ability to let their voice be heard, to fight for our rights and to continue to have access to those treatments that we need. So my message to them is, I understand that infertility is such a personal trauma and it's hard to talk about, it's hard to speak about, but I empower them to get active, let your voice be heard, let your story be shared, because the more that we speak up, the more that we share our story, the more that we can bring awareness and understanding to what the IVF process is, the better, hopefully that we can see change through that.
Thank you for your courage. Thank you all. I am briefly assuming the duties of the chair while Chair Hassan votes. Professor Realio, Chair Hassan and I helped to lead a bipartisan delegation to Beijing last fall. And our bipartisan delegation unanimously and with force raised directly with President Xi our insistence that China take stronger action to end the export of fentanyl precursor chemicals from China's chemical manufacturing sector onward, much of it to Mexico, where it's synthesized and the fentanyl winds up on the streets of the United States. What is your assessment of progress or a lack of progress that's been made on China living up to its commitment, which were reinforced at a bilateral meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi, to crack down on fentanyl precursor exports?
So while I welcomed your delegation's visit, we were excited to see the fact that you were there to provide some more pressure, and the San Francisco summit between Presidents Biden and Xi. There were some small incremental steps, but we have yet to see what is going to come of it. I'm in the trust but verify camp. And more importantly, nothing happens in China without the CCP knowing. So there are some arguments that, they can't control the big pharmaceuticals or the big chemical companies are known. It's more the smaller ones that are very hard to, there's always going to be an excuse as to why they're not enforcing. And this is where I think that we need to hold them accountable with regular, verifiable reports on law enforcement actions that they've taken, or more importantly, also for them to share with us their intel on which of the illicit fentanyl and precursor chemical companies they're looking at, and then more important, what actions they're taking against them. Then we also spoke earlier in the hearing about the Chinese money laundering organizations. So China makes money on both sides. So it makes money through the precursor chemicals and the fentanyl it sells to the Mexican cartels and others. But then also they're making 1% to 2% on the money that they're laundering, which are US dollars that are very precious to the Chinese who have very limited access to hard currency. So there's not really this interest. Perhaps there's a diplomatic interest because they've been shamed into a corner to make it look like they are playing ball with us. But I think we have to hold them to account much more. It's only been the first meeting was in late January of the new joint kind of working group on fentanyl. But whether it's quarterly or every month even, to see what actions they've taken, that's the question I have as to how true the commitment is, not by word, but by action.
Thank you, Professor. And Mr. Urban, on a bipartisan basis here in the Senate and in the administration, there's a strong will to sustain that pressure on the People's Republic of China to end the export of fentanyl precursor chemicals to our hemisphere and anywhere in the world. Were China to live up to its obligations to end that export business, from what other sources in the world do you expect the gap in the market might be filled?
Sure. So if the Chinese chemical companies were no longer a source of supply for the Mexican cartels, I think the first place they would go is India. I think they would source India as a possible place for their chemicals. If the Chinese lived up to this agreement, I think as the Mexican cartels had to adapt to a different source of supply, whether it be India, Eastern Europe, or another Asian country, it would present investigative opportunities because these are other places where we have joint relationships and work with those other countries like India and on ongoing investigative matters. So that would be the first place I would look for the Mexican cartels to go to.
Well, I'll ask my office to place an inquiry with DHS and DOJ to ascertain whether current law enforcement cooperation relationships are postured to begin those investigations or augment what investigations are already underway now. To what extent are we seeing supply entering the market from sources other than China at this moment?
To my knowledge, there aren't any. The Chinese are still the primary precursors chemical suppliers to the Mexican cartels. That has not changed yet. And there's not intelligence that certainly I'm aware of that indicates that the Mexican cartels are seeking other sources of supply, significant other sources of supply for those chemicals.
Professor, please characterize rest of world demand and consumption.
Fentanyl itself, the U.S. and China and Canada are still the primary consumers of illicit fentanyl, and that's why the rate of deaths are so dramatic in our two countries. We're starting to see, so there's two ways we look at fentanyl. There is legitimate fentanyl that's diverted. These are the ones that you've heard about stolen from hospitals or someone who actually takes it from the supply chain that's legitimate. Then the one that we're looking at in our hearing today is illicit fentanyl. So I spend a lot of time working in Latin America, so it's obviously in Mexico, but we are starting to see reports of fentanyl being intercepted in Guatemala, Costa Rica, Panama was a diversion case, and Colombia. And I work a lot in Colombia where we're starting to see fentanyl-laced and other synthetic drugs start to appear. Post-COVID, all the discotheques and bars have reopened, which is the point of sale for a lot of these kind of drugs. And we've actually seen the Colombians start to ask for increased awareness and training on how to handle synthetic drugs. And also, you know that Colombia still continues to be the top producer of cocaine that also need precursor chemicals that also come from China. And these are the things that we're looking at. And the other day, on Friday, Secretary Blinken was at the UN in Vienna on a global meeting, basically warning that this fentanyl crisis is coming your way. A lot of it is because there's underreporting, and then more importantly, people don't recognize what a fentanyl overdose looks like. Here in the US, we actually have access to Narcan, and there are ways that the numbers are so high because we're tracking the numbers. Other countries don't necessarily commit a death to an autopsy. That's why other countries that might be experiencing fentanyl-related deaths are not recording them. And the numbers are lower in Canada, I understand, because they don't test for cause of death as much as we do in the United States. But it's concerning as it grows bigger and better. And also the Europeans are expecting fentanyl to arrive for their summer season of the party goers in places like Spain and Greece.
That was my next question is, given how addictive and lucrative this trade is, why hasn't it penetrated Europe?
It's starting now, and the bigger thing is perhaps they're not detecting it. It's kind of hard to detect because it's usually in capsule or pill format that doesn't emit the odor that the canine units that our colleagues at DEA use can detect heroin, cocaine, and marijuana that have an odor and that the dogs are trained for. So I was in Spain like 3 weeks ago where they had the first death of an adolescent, 14 years old, with what's called pink cocaine, which is actually a synthetic drug. And now the Spanish are trying to figure out who are the traffickers that brought it there. And we do know that the Mexican cartels are trafficking not just in cocaine, but maybe starting to bring those fentanyl-laced pills as well to a European market. As I mentioned earlier, it costs about 30 cents for these pills to be produced in a lab in Mexico. It's being sold on the streets here in front of Nats Stadium at $15 to $20 for that same pill. Extremely lucrative.
So what is the flow from precursor production to fentanyl production, to trafficking and sale in Europe? Can you map that for us, please?
It's a little bit different. The synthetics that they have in Europe are actually different drugs than what we have. Fentanyl is probably the last to enter the market. The bigger thing is because synthetics produce a much more effective high and a little bit more addictive and are easy to take because it's basically a pill. It's kind of an easier way to be introduced to drugs. And this is the part that I was trying to understand is how could you educate our partner nations about the fear that adolescents and younger people are going to be consuming the way that we do in the United States. But we probably can expect that the same exact routes that are maritime routes that are being used to push cocaine that here in the United States we don't consume compared to before are being shipped to Europe are probably the same exact maritime routes that are going to be used in order to piggyback with these synthetic drugs, including fentanyl.
Dr. Feldbaugh-Brown, your take, please, on the rest of world market and trends in production, trafficking, sale, use, and overdose outside of the United States. I think you need to turn on your...
Sir, you have said, why hasn't it not arrived to Europe? I would phrase it, why hasn't it not yet arrived to Europe? The reality is that there are always significant gaps in drug markets. Essentially, they are a function of traffickers being interested to building a new market. In the 1980s, when the United States started experiencing the cocaine epidemic, there was plenty of coca cultivated in the Andes and plenty of cocaine produced to supply Europe. Yet traffickers were not interested in developing those routes for another decade and a half. As I have mentioned earlier, Mexican cartels are bringing up significant networks around Europe. They are both partnering with Bulgarian, Turkish, Albanian actors. They are also starting to develop methamphetamine production in Europe, in places like the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain. Some of that meth is going for sales abroad, including to Asia Pacific, but those vectors are primary possibilities for shipping cocaine and for shipping fentanyl, and more importantly, for manufacturing fentanyl in Europe. It's also very possible that Chinese actors will be selling either finished fentanyl or other synthetic opioids or their precursors to actors within Europe. So in my view, it's a matter of time before it does hit in Europe, and in a matter of time where traffickers will seek to penetrate highly valuable markets in Australia, New Zealand, Japan.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I was just getting started. One more question, if I might, which is just the bipartisan border security measure co-authored by a member of the subcommittee, Senator Langford, included some provisions to substantially augment our capacity to detect interdict and stop fentanyl flows into the U.S. The story of that legislation is well known. Congressional Republicans stopped it in its tracks at the cynical and politically motivated request of the former president. I introduced some legislation last week as a potential stopgap measure to surge fentanyl detection equipment and technology to the southern border. I know, Mr. Urban, that you've touched on the importance of detection technology, technical advances in detection technology during your testimony today. But can you just comment for a moment on what more you think can be achieved if we field sufficient and more sophisticated detection technology at ports of entry?
So ports of entry, obviously, we want to detect the fentanyl before it comes in and is dispersed throughout the United States for sale. So the more resources you can surge at the border and ports of entry in order to detect with more sophisticated equipment that's needed, it'll benefit everyone in law enforcement. The second part of this is in terms of equipment that you would push out to the field within the United States. Your investigator narcotics unit needs those detectors so we can efficiently identify the fentanyl to protect the officer, to protect the public. So the more equipment that's being pushed out is a benefit to everybody in terms of efficiently moving forward with investigations and protecting officers as they deal with the threat.
Thank you, Mr. Urban. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff, and thank you all. I have a few more questions, and because I had to leave to go vote, there may be a little bit of overlap, so I apologize.
Everyone. Senator Ossoff, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Mayorkas, welcome back to the committee. And Mr. Chairman, I can't help but reflect on what's happened in the last few months in the Senate. No one, and I mean no one, is interested in or takes seriously lectures on border security from Senate Republicans. No one. In one of the most stunning acts of political cowardice in recent American history, a bipartisan border security bill co-authored by a conservative Republican member of this committee was put forward in the U.S. Senate. It would have tightened asylum standards to stop exploitation of the asylum system. It would have surged enforcement resources to the border. It would have meant more expedited removals of those who enter this country unlawfully. It would have empowered the federal government to take the fight to the drug cartels who are laying waste to communities across our country with fentanyl. A bipartisan border security bill co-authored by a conservative Republican member of this committee. And it wasn't just voted down by Senate Republicans, it was denied even a debate on the floor of the United States Senate. Because the former president of the United States, and he said this publicly, thought it wasn't in his political interest for the nation to be served. It wasn't in his political interest for a bipartisan border security bill to be enacted by Congress. The American people are smart. So all of the performative chest pounding today on border security is utterly disingenuous. When Senate Republicans abrogated their basic governing responsibility and refused even to let us debate and amend that bipartisan border security proposal, the American people see that and understand that. But Mr. Secretary, the American people also see and understand what's happening at the southern border. And just as they see the hypocrisy and cowardice of Senate Republicans on border security, they do not see success in the administration's handling of the crisis at the southern border. And I wonder if you have reckoned fully with the fact that you do not have a good faith partner in the minority party in Congress willing to work with you to advance bipartisan border security legislation. You are going to have to rely on your authorities, and it is past time to do so. So to the extent you have additional legal authorities that you can responsibly deploy to control this unacceptable crisis at the southern border that threatens our national security, it is long past time to do so. And that brings me to the budget request, because I can't understand this, Mr. Secretary. It's a $3 billion decrease from fiscal year 24 for CBP. You agree, I presume, that the situation of the southern border is a serious threat to U.S. national security?
I do, Senator. We
and that CBP personnel are essential to tackling this crisis, Mr. Secretary.
Most certainly.
And the President recently commented publicly that there were not sufficient Customs and Border Patrol officers and agents at the border, correct?
We need more resources, and one of those resources is additional personnel, Senator.
So why are you requesting a $3 billion decrease in the CBP budget for FY25?
Senator, the construct that we have proposed is a baseline budget plus a $4.7 billion contingency fund, and I am not certain that you are accounting for that $4.7 billion contingency fund in the gross amount that we are requesting for fiscal year 2025. That contingency fund is really the model is that additional funds would be released to us based on the number of encounters that we experience at the southern border. And so that $4.7 billion must be included when looking at our fiscal year 2025 request.
Are those funds explicitly allocated and reserved for hiring and deploying CBP officers?
They include our ability to hire
but it's
additional
funds
personnel.
that could be used for other purposes. I cannot, this is an insufficient request of the U.S. Congress, given the severity of what we're facing at the southern border.
I would be very, very pleased to work with this committee and the Congress on increasing the resources above and beyond that which has been requested.
So given the
Senator,
urgency of the need, why did you not request more funding for Customs and Border Patrol?
Senator, we work within the context of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. We continue to believe that the extraordinary resources that would have been delivered under the Senate's bipartisan legislation would have been transformative, not only in the provision of resources, but in the delivery of authorities that we currently do not have.
And I agree with you, but President Trump killed the bill for political reasons, and it's gone. You don't have a good faith partner in the minority here. Only you, through the funds that you request and use from the Congress in the appropriations process, and by using those authorities that there's discussion of you exercising, only you have the power to address this crisis, and I urge you to act with utter urgency to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. We will now take a break, and then when we come back, Senators Blumenthal and Sinema will still be allowed their first round questions, and then it's my intent to then go into second round for those members who come back for a second round. But we now stand.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing. Thank you to our panel. Just want to remind everybody in the room and everyone tuned in that we're talking about folks who were brought here as children and have been part of our society for 20 years in many cases. Children who were brought to the United States through no fault of their own and who are actively contributing and law-abiding and, as in many cases, law enforcement officers themselves, neighbors and community members. And in Georgia, we host and are proud to be the home of more than 17,000 active DACA recipients, folks who were brought here as children through no fault of their own and have participated in this program established with bipartisan support. It's something that's surprised me about the way this hearing has gone so far, Mr. Chairman, is this has for so long been a common sense, bipartisan question of basic fairness. And I hope that we can return to that spirit as we approach this issue, because it is urgent, in my view, that we pass bipartisan legislation that establishes a path to citizenship for these Americans who were brought here as children and who otherwise follow the law. So I want to ask you, please, Ms. Soto-Rodriguez. In Georgia, in recent months, many DACA recipients have seen substantially increased delays in the processing time for renewals. My office has received calls from DACA recipients as well as their employers. Work permits depend upon the renewal of DACA authorization. So from your perspective, what are the most profound impacts on the daily lives of DACA recipients when they're unable to timely renew their status?
I can tell you from my experience, because I just went through it just this past renewal. I did my renewal with the time that they tell us to do it. I was about to lose my job because my work permit was about to expire within a day. When the expiration came in, my driver's license was already expired, so I had no driver's license, and I had to talk to my chief from the police department to let him know what was the issue. So it affected me. All these delays, it's affected me, and also affecting all the DACAs as well.
How old were you when you were brought to the United States?
9 years old.
9 years old. You're now a patrol officer.
Correct.
Which department?
Blue Island Police Department.
And so the Blue Island Police Department, at a time when law enforcement organizations across the country are having a tough time hiring and retaining officers and deputies, stood potentially to lose a member of the force if your DACA renewal was not processed on time.
I mean, they were following just the rules, but they were able to help me too, because they knew that I was doing the right thing.
Sure.
By renewing my permit. It was just not my fault that my permit wasn't coming on time.
Ms. Soto-Rodriguez, what would be you've heard, there's been some theatrics at this hearing, and welcome to the United States Senate, but as you've heard all of the partisan speeches today and all the usual political talking points that people associate with Congress and see on TV, as someone who has lived the journey you have and who has achieved amazing things, and you're defending your community, you're enforcing the law with the Blue Island Police Department, what would be your message to senators up here who have been talking about this, the importance of establishing some stability, some permanency, about a path to citizenship for folks who were brought here as children, have been here for 20 years, have participated in the DACA program? What's your message to these politicians today?
Just like I mentioned in my story at the beginning, most of us come here because of our parents, and many of us are doing great things for the country, and especially because we don't see this country just as a country. Like, for me, this is my home. This is who I live, who I give my life for. So I wouldn't pick any other country. I know I'm Mexican. I know I wasn't born here, but this is my home. This is the only place I know since I was brought here.
Thank you, Ms. Soto-Rodriguez. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hawley.
Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for joining us today, and Professor Ossoff. We should perhaps determine whether we're distant cousins. I am grateful to you all for your expertise. Dr. Feldman, I want to discuss with you the prices that Georgians are paying for inhalers, children on Medicaid, seniors on Medicare, and everybody in between. First, I just want to note generally, the prices that Georgians are paying for prescriptions are outrageous. The stories that come to me in my office are shocking. from a constituent who right now is having difficulty making ends meet and affording cancer treatment, who watched their own friend die from being unable to afford cancer treatment, a veteran in Georgia who right now is having to scrape together thousands of dollars per month in order to afford leukemia treatment, kids and seniors with asthma or COPD who are having to pay exorbitant prices for inhalers, medical devices across the board, and the tremendous lobbying power of the pharmaceutical industry is a major driver of the outrageous prices that Americans pay. And of course, there's a balance that we have to strike between making sure that research and development and innovation are rewarded and the interests of patients and consumers, but this country is not getting the balance right. We made big progress capping the cost of insulin for seniors on Medicare Part D at $35 a month, finally empowering Medicare to undertake some negotiation with pharma over prices, but we have a long way to go. And let's talk for a moment, Dr. Feldman, about inhalers. And I know that some voluntary caps are now in place, but Medicare, Medicaid, still not participating in that. You've seen countless patients. You're a pulmonologist, correct?
That's right.
And so you've seen countless patients dealing with serious life-threatening asthma and COPD, is that right?
That's correct.
How long have inhalers been on the market?
The first metered dose inhaler was approved by the FDA in 1956.
1956. In the last few decades, have the active ingredients in these devices substantially changed?
No. Since 1986, there have been no inhalers for asthma or COPD with a new mechanism of action. That means of the dozens upon dozens of brand name inhalers that have been approved, not a single one has an active ingredient that is fundamentally different from other active ingredients in the same class.
For 3.5 decades, you're saying the active ingredients have been basically the same?
That's right. Some tweaks to the molecules where you get new active ingredients, but in the same class. And so fundamentally, no major breakthroughs in terms of managing these diseases from inhalers.
So why are so many Georgians and so many Americans still paying hundreds of dollars for these devices?
I think it comes back to really what we're focused on in this hearing today, which is these problematic patenting practices, product hops, where companies are taking decades-old active ingredients, getting patent protection for the delivery devices, for other aspects of the products, and it allows them to keep prices high by limiting generic competition.
So product hopping or device hopping, just for the folks tuned in from Georgia, define that in a nutshell.
That's where you take the same ingredient or set of ingredients and put them from an old delivery device into a new delivery device that may be no better than the earlier one, but it does have new patents. So it allows you to move people from an old device to a new device. If you're a brand name company, earn a lot more revenue by doing so, but to no benefit for patients.
And so that patent based upon no innovation of the underlying medicine, some nominal innovation of a device, then boxes out competitors, generics, and helps keep prices high, right?
That's exactly right.
Now, I do want to note some manufacturers have agreed to cap out-of-pocket costs for inhalers. Does that apply to Medicaid or Medicare?
It does not. Those caps do not apply to Medicare and Medicaid.
So for a kid on Peach Care in Georgia, for a senior, and I think, according to my notes here, 1 in 9 Medicare beneficiaries have COPD. Those caps don't apply.
That's correct.
Where else do we see this practice of device hopping or product hopping?
We see it really for all drug device combinations. What are drug device combinations? Those include products like insulin pens, inhalers, EpiPens, GLP-1 receptor agonists that Senator Welch was asking about. So it seems like kind of a niche set of products, but in fact, if you look at the top 50 drugs by Medicare spending in 2022 by gross spending, 40% are actually drug device combinations.
Yeah, just about every family in Georgia has had to think at some point about, do I need to carry around an EpiPen for my child who has an allergy? Do I need to purchase an inhaler for my child with asthma or for a grandparent suffering from COPD? And yet these abusive practices where there's not innovation on the underlying drug, but there's some nominal change in the product, is boxing out competition and keeping prices high. And this is, Mr. Chairman, a place where I hope we can achieve some bipartisan consensus to make progress for Georgians who are struggling for these basic medical products. Thank you, Dr. Feldman. Madam President, for years, too many Democrats have been in denial about the national security risks at our southern border. And I have been critical of fellow Democrats who have failed to acknowledge these risks, who have failed to recognize that knowing and controlling who enters our territory is fundamental to our sovereignty and our national security. But now, Madam President, the situation has changed. There are more than enough Democratic senators ready and willing to pass a strong bipartisan border security bill, a border security bill co-authored by a conservative Republican senator, Senator Lankford of Oklahoma, who's done extraordinary work crafting this legislation. A bill that would surge enforcement resources to the southern border, that would tighten asylum standards, that would expedite the removal of those who abuse asylum to enter our country unlawfully, that would hire urgently needed Border Patrol officers and take the fight to drug cartels flooding our communities with fentanyl. This is a bipartisan bill to help defend the nation against terrorists who would exploit weakness at our southern border to enter our country and kill Americans. And now it's Republican senators who have already once blocked and this week are threatening again to block bipartisan border security legislation. Why, the American people ask, would Republicans in Congress block border security legislation amidst a national security crisis? The answer is simple. Asked recently on Fox News why Senate Republicans were blocking the Border Act, Senator Lankford, the Republican co-author of the bill, put it very simply, quote, President Trump said, "Don't fix anything," during the presidential election. President Trump said, "Don't fix anything," during the presidential election. The former president would rather wield the border as an election issue than see Congress secure it. And Republicans in Congress appear to be falling in line, even though it leaves the country at grave risk. Madam President, I urge my Republican colleagues to reconsider their position. Just as I have criticized Democrats who for years buried their heads in the sand about the threat at the southern border, just as I have criticized the Biden administration for its failures at the southern border, this is a time for Republican senators to stand up to President Trump and say, no, we will not obey your command to leave the country at risk. Instead, we will do what's right for the nation. Madam President, the threat of terrorism associated with unlawful entry at the southern border is real. It is pressing. If the Senate fails to pass border security legislation, refuses to tighten asylum standards, refuses to hire more Border Patrol officers, refuses to expedite the removal of those who abuse our asylum system to enter the country unlawfully, our nation faces a grave national security risk. The first vote we'll take later this week on the Border Act will not even be a vote on passage of the bill. It will be a vote on whether the Senate agrees to debate and consider amendments to the legislation. If Senate Republicans think this bill is imperfect, if they want to offer amendments, they will have that opportunity. So I urge my Republican colleagues, ignore the former president. President Trump said, don't fix anything during the presidential election. He's not your boss. He's not your constituent. We have an obligation to national security. The country's at risk. Let us debate the Border Act. And I yield the floor.
Recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this conversation has focused, I think, on what's practical legislatively. I want to ask each of you what's most pressing. So putting aside the question of what can practically be moved through this Congress, which, for each of you, please, beginning with you, Ms. Goitein, which single statutory reform, one, in brief, do you believe is most pressing with respect to presidential emergency authorities?
I think it is the congressional approval requirement for national emergency declarations. And the reason that I think that is not only because it can be done immediately, but it has the biggest bang for the buck because it significantly curtails the potential for abuse of more than 130 different emergency powers, and it does so by restoring the balance of power between the president and Congress in a way that's just good constitutional hygiene. So I agree with something Mr. Hurley said earlier, which is that Congress should also examine the individual tools in the toolbox. Some of these are powers that arguably no president should ever have, such as suspending the prohibition on government testing of chemical and biological agents on unwitting human subjects. However, I think for the biggest bang for your buck, start with National Emergencies Act reform with a congressional approval requirement.
Thank you. Mr. Tallum?
Yeah, second that. Think of this as a meta law, and probably the ideal situation would be to reform and address and maybe repeal all of those emergency statutes. I just don't know how you'd go about triaging that. I think the single most important element, though, of reform is time limiting. An emergency is impossible to define in all its characteristics, but by definition, it should be time limited. Otherwise, it's not an emergency. So there should be some mechanism that by default ends emergency declarations unless Congress says, you know what, you're right, this is a continued problem, we're going to take a stand and we're going to extend it.
Mr. Healy?
Hate to be boring here, but I agree with my co-panelists. Despite what I said about addressing substantive powers, I do think that a sunsetting emergency declarations and requiring affirmative approval by Congress to extend them further is the most valuable reform that can be made if you have to pick one. And I think in particular it's valuable because, as I said a moment ago, you wouldn't have predicted recent presidents seizing on these two statutes, the Military Construction Codification Act and the HEROES Act, but we've seen that when presidential restraint in these areas starts to erode, there's a lot of creative lawyering in statutes that you might not have thought were bottomless wells of unilateral power can be turned to that purpose. And by sunsetting declarations and requiring affirmative approval, I think that tackles a large part of that problem.
Mr. Healy, and then we'll go back down the line this way. Which emergency power do you believe is most broadly or urgently threatening to civil liberties and due process rights?
The provisions of the 1934 Communications Act that were mentioned earlier, I think are pretty sweeping and staggering. Not something that a president needs, even in a genuine national emergency. I think the potential application of IEPA to U.S. citizens to directly target them and the lack of meaningful due process in that area is also a concern. But again, I think looking down the list of those 130 powers, we should expect that there's any number of them that will be put to uses that we couldn't predict in advance.
Thank you. Mr. Thallam, same question. The single power you believe most threatening to civil liberties and due process?
I second the 34 Communications law, especially in the context of creative lawyering and what communications means today versus what was envisioned in that law.
Thank you. Ms. Goitein?
I agree. The Communications Act and IEPA are probably the ones of most concern. I'm going to flag a third one since those two were already discussed, and that is a provision that allows the administrator of the Transportation Security Administration during a national emergency to exercise such powers over transportation as the Secretary of Homeland Security shall prescribe, which appears to be a completely open-ended delegation of authority to the Secretary of Homeland Security to control domestic transportation with no limits or specifications. And of course, the ability to move around freely is critical to many of the other individual liberties that we all enjoy. So that
Can I
one
just
worries
tag
me.
one quick thing? I think that the power you should be worried about is the one you haven't thought about. It's the creative, going through the archives and finding some obscure provision that no one's thought about in years, and imagining an administration 10, 15, 20 years from now pulling it out of the archives and saying, I think this authorizes a pretty unprecedented exercise of power.
Ms. Goitein, how could a administration use emergency powers to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power from one elected executive to the next?
I wrote about this a little bit in an article that I published in The Atlantic in 2019. To be honest, I'm reluctant to go into too much detail about how emergency powers could be abused in this way.
I think that's, with respect, what you're here to testify on.
Right. I think we need to be very cautious in having these discussions. One emergency power that actually falls outside the National Emergencies Act framework that I'm worried about is the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act is a law that allows the president to deploy federal military troops to quell civil unrest or to execute the law in a crisis. And there's a lot more to say about it, but it gives the president extremely broad and judicially unreviewable discretion to deploy troops in ways that could certainly be abused, and that could be abused in ways that could throw a wrench into the works in terms of a peaceful transfer of power.
Brief comment on the Insurrection Act from each of you. I'm over time now. If you could sort of, Mr. Healy, I'd like your perspective.
Yeah, I think it falls into the category of powers that can certainly be abused. I mean, it hasn't been invoked since the LA riots, I believe, in '92. But if you look at the discretion the president has under that act, it's certainly something that would be prudent to tighten up.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Hessen, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thank
Senator Ossoff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Rao, Dr. King, no flavored vape or e-cigarette products are currently FDA approved. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, tobacco is a flavor, so no non-tobacco flavored e-cigarettes have been authorized.
No non-tobacco flavored e-cigarettes, therefore other flavors have been authorized. And under the TCA, is it correct, Mr. Rao, that they are therefore not legal to sell in the United States?
That's correct.
And yet they're widely sold in the United States?
That's correct.
Why?
Senator, as we have discussed, it's a complex issue in terms of the legal landscape. We are taking enforcement efforts on a number of vectors to try to address the problem. Principally, the department has been engaged in defense of the FDA's marketing denial orders in district courts and courts of appeal across the country. That has been more than 80 cases to date, and we've prevailed in a dozen of those. In addition, we are working with the FDA and the U.S. Marshal Services on domestic seizures. There was a seizure earlier this year in Southern California in which 45,000 illegal cigarettes were seized. That's part of what we're doing to try to combat this problem. We recognize that there's more that can be done. We have brought a number of civil injunctive actions as well. But we, as part of this task force that has been previously mentioned, we are looking to engage with law enforcement partners across the executive branch to do more in this area.
Thank you, Mr. Rao. So none of the non-tobacco flavors, the flavors that are clearly, in my view, meant to appeal to kids, are FDA approved. None of them are legal to sell in the United States. Flavored products are still widespread in our communities. In Georgia, a 2019 study found that 1 in 5 high school students had vaped, often drawn in by flavors and bright packaging. And because the products that some students are accessing are unregulated and illegal, they're sometimes laced with other drugs. or contaminants. Last March in Lee County in southwest Georgia, a student was hospitalized after using a vape reportedly laced with THC and fentanyl. And a 13-year-old in Whitfield County, Georgia, suffered a stroke and paralysis after reportedly using a brightly colored blueberry raspberry vape. The toxicology report was positive for THC and PCP. How will the department prioritize enforcement aimed specifically at those products that are contaminated or which contain other deadly and illegal drugs?
Senator, it's the highest priority for the department. We share your concerns regarding the health risks with respect to vaping products that may contain additional dangerous products, products, again, that often originate in China. The department has brought criminal actions against individuals involved in the importation of counterfeit vaping-related items, and we would look forward, again, to working with the task force to bring more such actions going forward.
Mr. Rao, what's your candid message for Georgia families right now who fear that their middle school or high school student may unintentionally and inadvertently vape and consume something like fentanyl or PCP?
I want to send the message that the executive branch is taking a very aggressive approach to trying to combat this problem, using all available tools and working closely with law enforcement partners to consider all potential avenues for enforcement against this threat.
What does it look like to work with, for example, local law enforcement agencies in Georgia to make sure that there's not fentanyl in e-cigarettes and vape products that are being marketed to children?
Certainly the department and other law enforcement partners would appreciate the opportunity to engage with local law enforcement, which has...
Are you doing it yet?
It's certainly something that our law enforcement partners are constantly considering in terms of a potential option and are always open to that.
Considering, but so it's not a trick question, just so I understand, so that I can be helpful in connecting your team with the right local law enforcement agencies in Georgia. Are you currently working directly with local law enforcement agencies to identify, for example, fentanyl-laced vape pens in Georgia or elsewhere in the country? Is that something that my office can help facilitate, that liaison between you and local law enforcement in Georgia?
Yeah, it's certainly something that we would welcome facilitation on. I want to be sure that I'm providing correct information and connecting you with the right people. Again, I know our law enforcement partners constantly work with local law enforcement in all of their matters and would welcome engagement from law enforcement partners in Georgia to combat this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Rao. Thank you, Dr. King.
Thanks, Senator Ossoff. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you. So ordered.
Mr. President, how did it come to pass that in a nation whose founding document guarantees due process and civil rights and prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, a federal prison in Dublin, California, would become so notorious for the endemic sexual abuse of female inmates by prison staff that it would be known as Rape Club? Rape Club. Sexual assault and abuse of federal inmates by the warden, by the chaplain. Senator Johnson of Wisconsin and I led a bipartisan investigation of sexual assault in federal prisons. We found that in two-thirds of federal prisons that housed female inmates had been sexually assaulted by members of prison staff. We found that at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, in my home state of Georgia, for nearly a decade, unchecked corruption and civil rights abuses had been ongoing with the knowledge of the leadership of the Bureau of Prisons, and no effective action had been taken to address them. Pretrial detainees sleeping in paper pajamas, denied access to counsel, denied access to hygiene products, denied access to fresh air. Pretrial, presumptively innocent federal detainees. The human rights crisis behind bars in the United States is a stain on America's conscience. And Mr. President, we just passed the most significant federal prison reform legislation in many years. And now it's on the way to the desk of the President of the United States. I am grateful to my colleague, Senator Braun of Indiana, for joining me in authoring and introducing the Federal Prison Oversight Act, which has now been passed by the Senate and the House. This is landmark prison reform legislation. It will require the Inspector General of the Department of Justice to undertake ongoing and regular inspections of every single federal prison in the United States. It will establish an independent ombudsman at the Department of Justice to investigate the health, safety, welfare, and rights of incarcerated people and staff, who will also create a secure hotline and an online form for family members, friends, and representatives of incarcerated Americans to submit complaints and inquiries. It will require the IG to report the findings from its routine inspections of federal prisons and recommendations to Congress and to the public, and require the Bureau of Prisons to respond to all inspection reports within 60 days with a corrective action plan. We were able to pass this legislation because we worked together. Senator Johnson and I leading multiple bipartisan investigations of human rights abuses and corruption in the federal prison system. Senator Braun and I forming the Prison Policy Working Group to develop bipartisan solutions like this one. I'm grateful to my colleague from Georgia in the U.S. House, Representative McBath, for her tireless efforts to shepherd this bill to passage in the U.S. House. And today we passed it on the floor of the Senate. I'm grateful for the support of my colleagues, and let the leadership of the Bureau of Prisons know that the United States Congress will no longer tolerate the wanton and ongoing and widespread abuse of those who are in their custody. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Ossoff, recognized for comments.
Mr. Chairman, grateful to you for your leadership in facilitating this negotiation. I am grateful to Senator Hawley and Senator Rosen and Senator Merkley for their contributions. This is a historic moment for this committee. Georgians of all political persuasions, Americans of all political persuasions overwhelmingly agree that members of Congress should not be playing the stock market while we hold office, while we make policy that affects businesses and industries, while we have extraordinary access to privileged and confidential information. We should be focused on the public's interest and not our private financial interests. That's why Senator Kelly and I, nearly 2 years ago, introduced the Ban Congressional Stock Trading Act. That's why I've been honored to participate in this painstaking bipartisan negotiation under your leadership, Mr. Chairman, to get to a bipartisan framework to ban stock trading by members of Congress. I hope that my colleagues will join in reporting this favorably out of committee today, and that we'll be able to take action expeditiously on the Senate floor to pass this measure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. President. Senator Ossoff, you recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your testimony today and for your service. Mr. Rowe, I want to begin discussing Secret Service staffing and the extent to which HSI or other personnel are augmenting or backfilling inadequate Secret Service capacity generally and on the day of the assassination attempt. To what extent are HSI personnel, for example, filling close protection roles that would normally or optimally be filled by Secret Service personnel?
So, thank you, Senator, for that question. So, as we have done, even back when we were with Treasury, we enlist during campaign years the assistance of other law enforcement agencies in that department. So, when we were in Treasury, we used ATF, we used IRS-CI. When we transferred over to the Department of Homeland Security, we have brought that practice with us. So going into a campaign year or during a national special security event like the United Nations General Assembly, we will enter into a memorandum of assistance for the campaign with HSI. HSI will provide post standers, essentially federal agents, law enforcement, to be able to help secure a site. When it comes to close protection, the only time that we will utilize them is during a United Nations General Assembly, where they may be utilized to protect a low-level head of state or provide security at a hotel in New York City where those protectees are staying.
So on the day in question, all of the former president's close protection detail were full-time Secret Service personnel?
They were, and they were assigned to the Donald Trump detail.
Okay. Interoperability with other federal and state and local law enforcement agencies, specifically on communications. What have you determined to date played a role in failures to swiftly communicate between agencies the suspicion or identification of a threat?
Well, I think there was a delay in reporting, not having that real time. So as they were closing in on him, as information is known, as...
Be more specific when who were closing in on him.
As local law enforcement were closing in on him, as he's seen scurrying across the roof, right? That information, and we're getting to the bottom of that. We're working on trying to figure out what was the delay. Why didn't we hear that coming out of the unified command? So based on the information I have right now, what I can tell you, Senator, is that apparently not having that real-time information is what really hindered us in being able to understand more than it was just the locals working an issue at the 3 o'clock. There was actually a little bit something more urgent than that.
Does it appear that that is due to a lack of communications links between relevant officials and agencies, or poor communications practices and a failure to report?
I don't want to rule out. I want to have a neutral opinion on that. So I don't know if it was poor practices. I can tell you that the interoperability, not being able to have that technical fix, which is a lofty goal to be able to do that, is something that has been a hindrance. But that's why we use a counterpart system.
So there, in fact, is not the capability when an intergovernmental, interagency team is deployed to secure a site like this and to mount, if necessary, a quick reaction. There is not currently the capability for example, state law enforcement SWAT personnel or local law enforcement officers to communicate directly with Secret Service officers on site?
So technically you could do it, but it would take a long time to get it done. And for a 1-day or an 8-hour operation, it requires a lot. And it would be months of planning, of knowing that we are going to go to this particular jurisdiction and that we're going to need your frequencies, the keys, and we're going to need to load you into our radios, and you're going to be needed to load it into ours, and vice versa.
Right. Well, this presents potentially, I think, an opportunity for the Homeland Security Committee. I mean, not just in an executive protection context, but any complex incident response, any counterterrorism, any natural disaster context. The inability swiftly to link personnel from disparate jurisdictions at the local, state, and federal level is a vulnerability for the nation, is it not?
I would think, and based on my experience, being able to talk to other agencies in real time certainly would assist in that response.
Mr. Chairman, do I have time for one more question?
No. Yes.
Thank you. I know others have touched on this. One of the things that's been most baffling to the public has been the failure to fully secure this structure, which even to a layperson's uninformed eye clearly presents as a site from which an attack on the former president of this event could be mounted. And it had particular characteristics that made it even more of potential value to an attacker. Just walk us through one more time. Is there not an established doctrine or practice or checklist by which such sites are assessed for threat and determine whether or not to be within or without of the security perimeter?
So, Senator, controlling high ground is something that is a must for us whenever we go into a location.
Yeah. Well, I know we're all eager for more information on why that task was not completed in this case. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Lee? You're now up.
No problem, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the recognition. And congratulations, Mr. Park, on your nomination. Welcome to the festive atmosphere of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I know that your family is proud of you. It's a joy to see, as you've been honored with this nomination, your family here with you. And there's been a lively discussion, a long-standing debate that's ongoing about senatorial courtesies and the separation of powers and advice and consent and the blue slips. I'll, of course, reserve judgment on any nominee throughout these proceedings, but I'll just share with you that I've not thus far heard any substantive criticism of you or your record in these proceedings. And I think you've been handling yourself very well. I want to ask you this question, since you just received some relevant questioning from a colleague. Will you faithfully apply the law without bias and without regard for your personal policy or political preferences?
Absolutely, Senator.
And as the Solicitor General for North Carolina, I think as you laid out earlier in this proceeding, you've been called upon to defend legislative clients, the state, on a whole range of cases without regard for your personal policy or political preferences, correct?
That's correct, Senator.
Let's talk about your approach to First Amendment jurisprudence. If you could give us an overview of your perspective on the crucial role that the First Amendment plays in our constitutional system and how you'll approach any First Amendment cases that might come before you, should you be confirmed.
Sure, thank you, Senator. So, as you're aware, there are two broad components to the First Amendment: the religion clauses and the speech clauses, and assembly is baked into that as well. I've had the good fortune to work on a number of First Amendment cases, and on the speech side of the equation as Solicitor General. And yeah, this is a increasingly active part of federal constitutional practice. And I am very well aware of the crucial role that the First Amendment plays, both the religion clauses and the speech clauses, to our constitutional fabric.
Based upon your experience, I want to talk about indigent defense, the Sixth Amendment, Gideon v. Wainwright. Based upon your experience in the courtroom, your experience in the law, how vital is it that indigent defendants have counsel, and how will you, should you be confirmed, act to ensure that everybody, regardless of their means, is afforded vigorous representation?
Thank you for that question, Senator. Yes, the Sixth Amendment right to counsel in criminal cases especially is just so crucial for our judicial system to function. Our judicial system is as you know, an adversarial model where you have two competing sides that are charged with zealously advocating for their clients' interests. It's hard to do that if you don't have counsel. And if you're even an educated layperson, there's a whole set of rules and procedures and technical doctrines that it's just pretty hard for someone who doesn't have legal training to do effectively. And sometimes you see it, and it's amazing, but that is the exception and not the rule. And so if I were fortunate to be confirmed as a judge, I would try to keep the importance of the right to counsel in mind.
And related to the capacity of a party in court to afford counsel is the capacity of a party in court to understand the proceedings. Mm-hmm. In Georgia, we have very diverse matters in the courts and diverse constituencies in court, and language access is a significant issue. I presume that you've encountered or are aware of similar concerns and challenges in North Carolina. What have you seen? What are the challenges faced by parties to civil or criminal proceedings with respect to language access, and how will you, should you be confirmed to this federal judgeship, ensure that parties to your courtroom have full access to the law and to justice, whether or not English is their first language?
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, as the child of immigrants, I am very well aware of the importance of being able to understand the proceedings. When you're in a courtroom, it's often not a friendly experience. It's quite intimidating for someone who doesn't have legal training. And I mean, it's doubly so, triply so, if you have trouble understanding the proceedings because of language issues. One example that comes to mind is I worked on a criminal appeal, a murder in Durham, where the defendant as well as the victims were both undocumented, and there was actually a mistranslation in the 911 call that materially affected some of the legal issues in the case about the accuracy of the description of the perpetrator. So I saw firsthand how important it was for those barriers and access to be overcome. And fortunately, in that case, it was Spanish, and so we were able to identify the inaccuracy in the translation and point that out to the court. But often in less common foreign languages, we might not be able to do that, and so it's just so important.
Thank you, Mr. Park. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Park, I'd like to just continue, Senator Hawley,
with a few questions and an expression again of gratitude for sharing these incredibly traumatic and difficult personal stories with the public and the subcommittee. Ms. Umberger, did I hear you correctly that you endured solitary confinement for 3 weeks after giving birth without access to your infant?
Yes, sir. That is what happened. In this this room for solitary for 3 weeks, so many things were going through my mind. It was so hot in there, no air conditioning. I would lay at the bottom of the door for air. Obviously, I couldn't shower properly. I didn't even have my property. Nobody could provide any updates on how my daughter was doing. Did she pass her hearing test? Is she okay? Yeah, I was scared.
And you were still in the early days of healing from surgery.
Absolutely.
You testified that you were able to hold your newborn baby for just 2 hours after giving birth, and that you didn't see her again for almost 3 years. Is that right?
Yes, sir. I had 2 hours to hold and look at her. I remember thinking just how pretty she was. Like I didn't deserve her. And I carried that memory. That's what I held on to.
Ms. LeBoy, did I understand correctly from your testimony that your granddaughter was born into a prison toilet after the prison and medical staff ignored your daughter's cries for help as she went into labor?
Yes, sir. Prison staff ignored her for hours, for days. That particular morning, she gave birth into a bowl. She was ignored. My granddaughter was unresponsive. If it wasn't for my daughter's quick thinking and the cellmates, I don't think my granddaughter would be here.
And your daughter and her cellmate had to resuscitate?
Yes, they did.
Infant?
My daughter did. The cellmate was behind the wall. She heard my daughter screaming for help, and my daughter didn't know the baby wasn't crying. She was unresponsive. So the cellmate was able to tell her through the wall to tap the baby and get the fluids out.
And when the prison staff finally arrived, they ridiculed.
It was too late when they arrived. The baby
made
was
jokes.
already. Yeah, they were very insensitive. They made jokes. She took her first swim.
After your granddaughter had been born
Yes.
into a prison toilet, that was the response of the prison
Yes,
staff.
they were very insensitive. They made jokes about it.
When you learned as a parent and as a grandparent the circumstances of your granddaughter's birth, how did you react? How did that make you feel as a human being?
Really hurts. It was painful. She actually, my first grandchild, my daughter's first child. I felt helpless to know that my daughter was scared, alone, that they ignore her, they disregarded her. They were very insensitive, so it really hurts me as her mother to know that they treated her like this.
Dr. Suffren, the subcommittee received dozens of reports, and I want to emphasize that for my colleagues on the subcommittee. We're hearing some very powerful personal testimonies. The subcommittee has received dozens of reports from currently and formerly incarcerated women that they went into labor, and then they were told they needed to wait, sometimes for days or a week, just to see a physician. You testified that access to health care may be variable, substandard, or even absent. I presume this means, doctor, that some state prisons and jails don't always have any qualified medical staff on site.
Thank you, Senator, for your question. And yes, that is true. Many jails, especially small rural jails, do not have medical staff on site 24/7. And in those cases, it's the custody officers who should always refer pregnant women with issues such as labor to a qualified medical provider or call 911. But that doesn't always happen. And a 2019 report from the Prison Policy Initiative, they reviewed policies at 50 state departments of corrections and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. They found that 24 states did not even codify that they had pre-existing arrangements for where they would take pregnant women in labor. Imagine that. No formal policy or protocol for where they would take a pregnant woman if she went into labor. They also found that 23 states' policies didn't include screening and treatment for high-risk pregnancies. But even at facilities that do have medical staff on site, the correctional officer is still the first point of contact. You can't just pick up the phone and call your obstetrician or your midwife or get yourself to a hospital labor and delivery unit. So correctional officers are tasked with triaging and being the gatekeepers to medical care, and they are sort of tasked with acting in the role of a nurse when they don't have any medical training to know when someone's having a pregnancy emergency or when they're in labor. And what that looks like, you've heard what that looks like, is that someone could be neglected either intentionally or due to the lack of knowledge of the custody staff, and she delivers in her cell.
Thank you, Dr. Suffren. Chair, thank you all for joining us. On that point about attribution and identification of foreign covert influence, Mr. Walker, give us a sense of your independent capacity, absent case-by-case warning or notification from the U.S. government of content on your platforms that is foreign covert influence.
It is challenging, as was talked about earlier. Russia has moved beyond paying for things in rubles and only working between 9 and 5 Moscow time. So they're increasingly making it more difficult to identify things. That said, we have more than 500 analysts and researchers working with our Mandiant team, Google Threat Intelligence. We're tracking between 270 and 300 different foreign state actor cyber attack groups at any given point, tracking activities, metadata, et cetera, feeding that through our services and sharing it with the security teams that are represented here and elsewhere in the industry, and also working with the FBI's
Let
Foreign
me
Influence
put it
Task
this
Force.
way. Do you think you're mostly across it and playing whack-a-mole, or do you think you fundamentally lack the ability to know how much you don't know?
I think the humble and probably accurate statement would be the latter, because the adversaries are always moving forward, and it is a constant cat and mouse game.
And when you mentioned earlier using machine learning or algorithmic tools to try to identify it, is that on the basis of network activity and posting tactics, as opposed to content where there's a risk of collateral damage? You might suppress bona fide American speech because oftentimes what the foreign actors are amplifying resembles perhaps extreme or polarizing speech that's happening organically in the country.
It's a deep and important question, and the answer differs to some degree across the different platforms, because a pure social network, as Mr. Clegg was referring to, will have more behavioral information. We may have more content-related or metadata style information. We do try and share across the different platforms where we can, but inherently there is some sort of assessment of the nature of the content. We talked a little bit about provenance and AI, or metadata and AI. That's going to be a component of it. Network activity is a component of it, and then behavioral signals will also be a component of it.
Okay, in addition to attribution, let's talk about authentication. Mr. Smith, you mentioned the Slovakian example, I believe. Let's game it out, right? I think we need to be able to discuss in the open how this might unfold in the United States and who bears responsibility for handling it. There might be some very compelling, seemingly authentic, deep fake audio clip, which is in fact fake and defamatory, implicating a candidate for office of the United States in the hours or days or weeks before an election. How confident are you that either you or another private sector actor or somebody else has the capacity to identify it as fake, particularly where we can't rely on one campaign or the other necessarily to, in good faith, acknowledge that something which is useful to them because it deliberately defames and mischaracterizes the statements or conduct of their political opponent isn't real?
Well, I'd say first, I think Kent had a word of wisdom in saying we always have to act with a sense of humility, and hence I think we should require of us an extraordinarily high level of confidence approaching certainty before we take action. Having said that, I do think, especially given our ability to use AI to identify the creation of a fake, and just the good old human judgment that comes from crowdsourcing, especially for video, we can identify a great deal. And I then think what it translates into is another part of your question. Great, what do we do about it? And there will be days, or it could be hours, when the most important thing we'll need to do is alert the public so that there is a well-informed conversation. But I also think this points more broadly to what is a systemic strategy to try to address the problem that we're worried about here.
Well,
and that's that we need to
because
focus
time is
on
short,
as well.
let me try this question, ask it of each of you. What will you do? What is your policy if in that critical time period before an election, there's deep fake content attacking a candidate for office, which can be demonstrated to be inauthentic, but cannot be decisively attributed to a foreign actor? How will you handle it?
We would label it. Yeah, we would label it so that users would see that the veracity, the truth of it is under real question. So we would label it.
What about how it's handled by the algorithm and its amplification or suppression?
We would also make available to us the ability to demote the circulation of it.
Mr. Smith?
Yeah, we don't have the same issue in terms of a consumer platform, but I think that the notification to the public, the labeling, I do think that's the essence of what we all need to be prepared to do very quickly.
And I would add to that we would notify the Foreign Influence Task Force so that there was government awareness of the situation.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. I've got a few more comments.
Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, yes or no question, please, for each of you, from Judge Brindisi to the end of the table. Will you pledge to faithfully apply the law without bias, without regard for your personal policy or political preferences?
Yes, Senator.
Yes, Senator.
Yes, Senator.
Yes, Senator.
Yes, Senator.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you all. Ms. Johnson, reflecting on your life, your background, your experiences, your upbringing, and now your experience as a federal prosecutor, what motivated you to pursue a career in public service and now a career as a federal judge?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I grew up the child of two career military parents, colloquially known as an Army brat. And just from a very young age, I learned the value of public service and commitment to being involved in the community and helping the community. And I think there's no higher calling for a lawyer than to use our legal training to give back to the community that has helped us. So it's really my parents' service in the military that made me want to serve the public at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And then if I am so fortunate to be confirmed to the bench, I can't think of a better way to use my legal training than to serve the public as a federal judge and having the impact on the citizens of the Northern District of Georgia.
One of the things that stood out as you emerged from a field of many potential nominees that Senator Warnock and I had the pleasure of meeting was the quality of your temperament, your composure, and your reputation for excellence and integrity. I want to thank you for your work as a federal prosecutor in Georgia. And in that role, you have worked closely with law enforcement partners at multiple levels. Can you please characterize for the committee your experience working with law enforcement in Georgia?
Yes, Senator. As part of my prosecutions, we partner with both local and federal law enforcement, and it is always helpful to an investigation when we are able to share resources with our local law enforcement partners. And my experience in the Northern District of Georgia has been that we all have the same goal of enforcing the laws and ensuring the safety of the public.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Ms. Davenport, would you please characterize how you'll approach First Amendment cases that may come before your courtroom?
Certainly, Senator, thank you. In all cases that come before me, I will look at the facts of the case with an open mind and give the parties the opportunity to be heard. I will diligently research the law and whatever precedent is binding and then apply it faithfully, consistent with the precedent of the Supreme Court and the 10th Circuit. I think that our First Amendment rights are some of the most fundamental rights that we have, and they bear protection like all of our fundamental rights.
Thank you, Ms. Davenport. Ms. Johnson, what have you learned from working with victims and defendants in your experience as a federal prosecutor, and how will that impact how you interact with parties in your courtroom should you be confirmed to a federal judgeship?
Senator, my work with victims and defendants has been incredibly rewarding, and interacting with people on an individual basis, treating people as individuals, is the thing that I take away from my experience as a prosecutor, that everyone that I encounter, whether defendant, victim, or witness, is a person with a history, and we have to take that into account when we are applying the law to the facts, and I would do that where I was so fortunate to be confirmed as a judge.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I can accept that staffing shortages are the principal driver, or even a principal driver, of the failures of Pria. And I'll give you a chance to respond to that in a moment, Mr. James. But I want to ask you, Ms. Abate, you are a certified Pria auditor, correct?
Yes, I think I'm on inactive status now, though, just to be clear.
Okay. As the chairman knows, when I was chairing the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, we conducted a number of investigations into sexual abuse in the federal prison system. One investigation found that in 2/3 of federal facilities that had housed female inmates, there had been sexual abuse of female inmates by members of the staff, 2/3. At Dublin, now infamous, the perpetrators included the warden and the chaplain. And when we look back at the Pria records at these facilities, and in particular Coleman and Dublin, two of the most notorious, where certainly in Dublin's case, I believe also in Coleman's, it was an open secret in the system that a culture of permissiveness and abuse was endemic. Dublin was so infamous that it became informally known as, quote, rape club. Again, the chaplain and the warden engaged in sexual abuse. But during the periods of crisis at these facilities, every single Pria audit found that Coleman and Dublin were compliant with every single one of the 45 Pria standards. They met or exceeded every single standard. How is that possible? How can a prison with such an endemic crisis of sexual abuse, but it's known as rape club, and the warden and the chaplain are sexually abusing inmates, meet or exceed repeatedly every single one of the 45 Pria standards?
It's an excellent question, and there's a couple answers. First, for the BOP in general, not even just including Coleman and Dublin, it appears as if the contract for the Pria audits, which is run by Pria Auditors of America, I believe is who has it now, Nakamoto had it previously, every Pria auditor that they send to a facility, whether it's a 500-bed camp or a 2,500-bed correctional complex, the auditor is limited to 3 days on site. That is not enough time to do an appropriate audit, a robust audit. That also is not fair to BOP, because when they do implement these policies and practices and Pria standards, their passing Pria audit is just as suspect as the ones at Dublin and Coleman, right? So it's not fair that the lowest bidder is going to get these contracts for the audits. I understand the procurement process, but there's also a way that you can write your proposal to ensure that people have adequate time on site. And I personally have raised this issue myself with Director Peters at least 3 times in person, 2-on-1 meetings with her. This is not something that the department doesn't know. I know that there's a lot of stuff involved in breaking contracts or getting new ones, but that's just a huge, huge problem. It's a problem that doesn't protect folks by ensuring that Pria is implemented. It leads to the impression of, or the actuality of, inadequate audits. And it makes it impossible for an audit to be conducted pursuant to the Pria Auditor Handbook that auditors are forced to comply with.
Well, I guess, are they forced to comply with it? So
They are.
Sorry. I'm not sure they are complying. I mean, at Coleman, 6 male officers repeatedly raped and abused at least 10 women. As part of the Pria audit process, auditors must review sexual abuse complaints, interview prisoners and staff, and review facilities, policies, and practices, correct?
Correct, absolutely.
And clearly, seems to me, if interviews are not conducted with female inmates at these facilities, then they've not fulfilled their inspection obligations, right?
That is true.
Okay, so in 2021, Pria auditors were not able to interview a single female prisoner at Coleman as part of their audit, and they weren't able to interview them because BOP had transferred all of them out of the prison 2 days before the on-site portion of the audit. At a time when sexual abuse was rampant in the facility, they removed the women from the prison in advance of the Pria audit. That's shocking. What's also shocking is that then Coleman passed its audit.
I agree.
How? And I know you didn't, I don't think you were on that team.
No.
I've
never actually conducted an audit. I don't know many facilities that would invite me.
How can this be so broken?
So that's not uncommon that facilities will transfer people in custody out when an auditor's coming to town. It's unusual that a whole population of women would be transferred. If you can't interview folks that are in custody, then there is a notation where you can say none were available at the time. So it's notated on the audit report. So the audits are they give us something, but they don't give us everything. And they were never intended to ensure that sexual abuse wasn't occurring at a facility. You can comply with all the standards, you can have all the policies, you can have the practices, you can have the records of people getting training, you can interview the people you're supposed to interview, and you can still have rampant sexual abuse in a facility. That doesn't mean that Pria is not working. It just means that Pria doesn't work to fix systems that are in such states of crises. Pria does work to strengthen other systems to ensure they don't reach that point, but it doesn't show that sexual abuse isn't occurring. The audit report from Dublin is long as long can be, almost well over 100 pages, right? And it goes through the steps that that auditor undertook. I have no opinion on whether the auditor was good or bad. The audit report looks like it was written properly. And we know that sexual abuse occurs. The audit doesn't say, is sexual abuse happening? Are people being abused? No, it doesn't. It says, if sexual abuse occurs, do they investigate? Do they report? Do they let the person know what happened with the outcome? Was there any discipline? That's it.
Well, thank you for your expertise, and I would just offer, Mr. Chairman, that if audits under the Prison Rape Elimination Act, pass with flying colors facilities with endemic staff on inmate sexual abuse, and pass with flying colors even after every woman in the facility is transferred out 2 days before the audit, then I don't think that Pria is working.
So can I rely on your expertise in this issue? Because I was just asking my staff about this, Ms. Abate.
Senator Ossoff.
Just picking up there for a moment on MCAS, do I recall correctly that not only had FAA not been informed of the scope of the system and the certification process, but also the carriers and flight crews had not been fully briefed or briefed at all on the functioning of the system?
That's my understanding, Senator.
And was the decision not to inform flight crews of how the system functioned linked to the decision to withhold information from FAA?
I don't know that they were necessarily linked, but my understanding was there were economic considerations that if pilot training was required, there were financial penalties, and that drove part of that decision-making.
Penalties imposed by?
My understanding, it was an aircraft order contract between Southwest and Boeing.
Who at Boeing made the decision to withhold that information from FAA, and who at Boeing made that decision not to inform carriers and flight crews of how the system functioned?
So I was in the private sector during that time, so I wasn't involved in the particular instance. I don't have that level of detail, but we can certainly provide.
But FAA must, right?
We have information we can certainly provide, sir.
Okay. Will you provide that to the subcommittee, please?
Yes, we will.
You mentioned that the FAA's oversight became, I think the words you used were too reactive, too passive, unable to adapt to change. What kind of change would the FAA have been able to adapt to had it been more agile in this case?
With respect to the January 5th incident?
With respect to your oversight of Boeing quality control over the last decade. And every time I say your, I know you haven't been there for 10 years, and you joined last year. So.
I think when I talk about technology evolution, I'm talking about some of the technology in the cockpit. For example, there have been advancement in auto landing technology, advancements in technology in types of aircraft that we're seeing. So we're starting to see new forms of aircraft like advanced air mobility. We're seeing drones. We're seeing supersonic flight. So all these technological changes are presenting challenges, and our system needs to be flexible enough to adapt to those challenges.
But a lack of visibility into potential decline in quality control related to the incidents that this subcommittee has been focused on have not been related to these sort of high-profile next-generation evolutions of technology, right? It's about whether or not the manufacturer and its contractors have been implementing best industrial practices, correct?
It is, and I think in that situation, we're really talking about utilizing better data to have a better idea of what's actually going on the factory floor.
What kind of data would have revealed to the FAA, had it been collected, that you needed a more aggressive approach to examine the industrial processes?
So since the January 5th incident, when we asked Boeing to put together this comprehensive plan, there are now 6 key performance indicators that we monitor constantly that tell us how they're doing on traveled work, on employee training, on ticketed items at the end of production, those metrics give us a very clear picture of the health of the company. So if those metrics move into the yellow, we know there's a concern. If they move into the red, we know we have a serious concern.
And when you look retrospectively at the period of concern, was there a decline in those metrics?
We just started the metrics this year.
Well, how'd you determine that those are the things that you needed to track?
We looked for metrics that would reinforce the comprehensive plan. So there were certain changes we wanted to make, and for travel to work is a perfect example because that was a big
Forgive me,
issue.
Administrator, here's what I'm driving at. You said that FAA was too static or passive in its oversight, that it was unable to adapt to change. What specific change was what specific change at Boeing or its suppliers was FAA unable to either identify or able to identify and unable to adapt to?
Well, I think in this particular case, the degradation of the quality management and safety management system.
When you certify the airworthiness of an aircraft, you are also certifying the production line, is that correct?
No, I mean, the production line has been certified.
So when changes are made to the production line, when changes are made to manufacturing processes, but the airframe has not changed, are you alerted to that? Does that trigger some kind of inspection or examination or recertification related either to the airframe or to the production line?
It depends on the magnitude of the change, but there should be, a manufacturer would have a risk analysis process that would run, and that would happen before any changes were made, and we would have visibility into that.
There have been some high-profile, catastrophic Airbus accidents in the last 15 years. Air France disaster related to the design of the flight control inputs for the two pilots and a stall that resulted. So there have been significant safety concerns as well on the other side of the Atlantic. How does the European approach to fulfilling the same obligations that you have for safety differ from the U.S. approach? In what ways might it be better, and in what ways might it be inferior?
I don't know. I don't have specifics to share with you on that. I can say that we do benchmark against, for example, number of airworthiness directives and that type of thing, and we seem to be largely tracking along the same lines. But I can follow up with any additional information.
You don't have a sense of how, philosophically or by design or the structure of your authorities, EASA or FAA take different or similar approaches to certification and inspection?
I don't, but I can follow up with you on that.
Okay. Obviously, civil aviation safety, very important in Georgia. 100 million passengers went through Hartsfield-Jackson last year. This matters a lot to my constituents. Does what's happened at Boeing in recent years reflect operational or management failures at FAA?
It depends on what you're referring to specifically. I think with MCAS, I wouldn't necessarily say so, but we did not have
I think what I'm referring to, so I think that the events that we're, the chairman, the scope of the inquiry, as I understand it, we have MCAS with failure to disclose to FAA and failure to disclose to carriers and flight crews, and we have, I think, evidence of quality control failures, as well as the accumulation of a culture that made it difficult for leadership or regulators to understand where corners are being cut. Is that a fair characterization, Mr. Chairman?
I think it certainly is.
So is the fact that that happened, or is alleged to have happened or may have happened, does that reflect a failure or potential failure by the FAA?
It's certainly enough of a circumstance to cause me to relook at how we're doing oversight and try to improve that.
Thank you, Administrator.
Ossoff, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Congresswoman, Mr. Zollers, Mr. Hartogensis, congratulations on your nominations. I want to discuss accountability. Just if I could, by a show of hands, how many of you have had to fire somebody? All three. Are you prepared, if there is cause, as members of this board to terminate any Postmaster General if necessary. Ms. Demings.
Senator, thank you for that. And yes, I've been in the position of having to hire and terminate. And termination is based on performance. And when you're not meeting the core mission of the institution, you don't deserve to remain in your job. If you are working along with the other stakeholders to meet the core mission of the organization, you deserve to keep your job. And as the governor, I will be clear about both.
Yeah, in my case, Senator, I also have a lot of experience, unfortunately, in letting people go. I think to be clear about what we do at the Board of Governors, we do set annual goals for the Postmaster General, and we track those goals on a quarterly basis and give him feedback along the way on how he's doing against those goals. When I left a year ago, there was tremendous support for the DFA and for the Postmaster General. So I'm not sure that anything has changed. But if it was obvious that the Postmaster General needed to be replaced, that's one of our primary responsibilities, is to hire and fire the Postmaster General, and we take that very seriously.
The short answer is yes. I think there are a few criterion where the Board of Governors should act with the Postmaster General. One is lack of performance based on the milestones. Another one is failure to learn from mistakes. And mistakes will happen if it seems like the same things are being repeated without learning. And the last one is lack of transparency to us, to Congress, if we feel like the management is hiding things, sweeping things under the rug, that's cause for termination.
Thank you all. Let's talk about USPS performance in my state. As of late spring, on-time delivery of first-class mail in North Georgia was at 36%. And as you all know, that means seniors aren't receiving their prescriptions. It means small businesses aren't receiving supplies and can't get products to market. It means that vital court correspondence, notices to appear, notices of eviction are not being received by citizens. Postmaster General came here to this room and acknowledged that USPS was failing my constituents in Georgia. Mr. Zollers, you were on the board at the time that some of these changes were being planned. Why did USPS, why has USPS, as the PMG acknowledged, failed my constituents?
Yeah, I was not there, but I think the primary impact was the Atlanta consolidation, and I was not on the board when that was executed. I can tell you that we made some changes. We had a bit of a problem in Richmond, backed off that one when I was on the board through conversations with the Postmaster General. I can't speak specifically to what happened in the Atlanta consolidation. I'm aware that there were issues. That's obviously not where we want to be in terms of performance. We should be at 95% on time for all of our products. And so that's something that we would strive to try and get to in Georgia. I have family in Georgia.
Yeah, but you are intimately aware of and were on the board when this Delivering for America plan, which included the consolidation to regional distribution centers, was being planned.
That's correct.
So
I don't think the problem was with the...
Why has the implementation of that plan, based upon your extensive and deep knowledge of that plan and your role in developing it, why did it lead to what is undeniably abysmal failure to serve my constituents in Georgia?
We had obviously execution problems. I'm not sure that the plan was necessarily the bigger part of the issue. I think more of it was execution. I don't really know the details about what went wrong with the execution, so I can't really speak thoughtfully to that.
Serious execution problems. I sat in a room full of USPS executives at that Palmetto facility, and I asked a very simple question. Who was in charge of executing this? There was silence. No one was in charge of executing this. As you all know from your management experience, when no one is in charge and no one has primary responsibility for executing a challenging and complex task, it is unlikely to be done successfully. How is it possible, Mr. Zollers, that this organization failed to make one person responsible for the execution of something so complex?
I really can't account for that.
Will you look into it deeply? Should you be confirmed and report back to me?
I certainly can, yes.
Will all three of you commit that, should I call you or request a meeting for information about the performance of USPS in Georgia, that you will return my call within a day and meet with you within a week?
Yes, absolutely.
Sure.
The Postmaster General does not personally read the mail that I send him, will you?
Yes, I will.
Of course.
Let's talk about data. There's been some apparent improvement since the Postmaster General came under harsh and bipartisan pressure in Congress to improve USPS performance in Georgia. But I have some questions about the integrity of data that USPS reports to the public and to Congress. Will you provide me, my office, and this committee with any and all relevant information that will reveal how these numbers are crunched and what they mean?
Sure.
Yes.
I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.